The night it happened, I realized something brutal. I could save strangers in their worst hour, but I couldn't convince my own family that I mattered. I'm Jillian Ross, and I've spent years swallowing the quiet kind of hurt, the kind that comes from being dismissed, overlooked, talked over by the very people who were supposed to see me first. But nothing cut deeper than hearing my sister-in-law laugh about how someone like me could never handle real pressure, especially when I was the one who'd kept her brother alive. I stayed silent that night, but silence has a way of cracking open, and mine was about to explode. I pulled into Colorado Springs, under a sky caught somewhere between winter and spring, the kind that couldn't decide whether to let the mountains keep their last veil of snow or peel it away for good. The air had that faint chill that clings to early March evenings, dry and crisp, settling against my skin as soon as I stepped out of the car. After months spent in New Mexico's desert wind, the cold here felt strangely heavier, like it carried memory. I shut the driver's door and let the silence of the parking lot settle around me. The lights from the steakhouse glowed warm against the fading daylight, drawing long golden lines across the asphalt. I caught my own reflection in the window. Fatigue softened the edges of my face, a familiar companion after long stretches away from home. But the look in my eyes wasn't just exhaustion. There was something else, something quieter, attention low and steady, like a glass of water sitting perfectly still until someone knocks the table. From where I stood, I could already see Ethan and Emily approaching the restaurant doors, their laughter drifting across the parking lot. Even from a distance, they had a sort of brightness to them, loud, warm, effortless, the kind of presence that fills a room before they even step into it. My parents always gravitated toward that kind of energy. It made gatherings feel easy for them, like the picture of a family they wanted to believe we were. I followed them inside, letting the warmth settle over my shoulders as the door swung shut behind me. The scent of roasted garlic and sizzling steak drifted through the space, mixing with the low hum of conversations and the clink of glasses. The restaurant was crowded in the way places get on a Friday night, dates tucked into corners. Families gathered for early dinners, co-workers celebrating the end of another week. When my parents spotted me, their smiles rose like well-practiced gestures. Kind enough, polite enough, but restrained, like they weren't quite sure what to do with me or how much enthusiasm they were supposed to show. I stepped toward them, offering the type of hug that comes with years of keeping things simple to avoid making anything complicated. "You made it," Mom said, smoothing her scarf as if she needed something to adjust. "Traffic was light," I answered. She nodded as though that were the most neutral reply she could receive. My father patted my shoulder, already shifting his attention back toward Ethan and Emily. They were the spark of the evening. I was the background glow. Our table was long, set with white napkins, polished cutlery, and a centerpiece of dried pine sprigs meant to look rustic and intentional. My parents sat near the middle. Ethan and Emily slid into the seats closest to them. I was guided toward the chair by the window, an unspoken assignment, one I'd grown used to. The seat was slightly colder than the others, probably because of the draft sneaking in from the frame. Outside, the sky was turning lavender, the mountains darkening into silhouettes. Inside, everything gleamed warm and amber. Emily launched into a story before my coat had even settled on the back of my chair. She had a gift for filling silence not with depth, but with detail. Her hands moved when she talked, bracelets jingling softly as if applauding her own punchlines. Ethan leaned toward her, nodding, smiling, reinforcing her presence the way a devoted partner does when they believe their relationship is part performance, part partnership. My parents joined in every few seconds, adding their laughter in the places where Emily clearly expected it. She was talking about a client at her design firm, or maybe it was an event she'd coordinated. I couldn't tell. Her voice wrapped everything in the same enthusiastic sheen. Ethan took his turn, slipping into a monologue about a new project at work, and my father leaned in like this was breaking news. Pride shaped the lines around his mouth, the same lines that rarely deepened when he looked at me. I sat quietly, letting my water glass sweat against my fingers. It wasn't that I wanted attention. I just didn't want to feel like the quiet space between other people's conversations. but I'd played this role for so long that my body entered it without thought back straight. Shoulders relaxed, half smile in place, listening without being asked to contribute. The server came by with menus, and the others poured over theirs with the excitement of people treating this dinner like a celebration. I already knew what I wanted, but waited anyway, giving the moment space, not wanting to seem impatient. When the waitress returned to take our orders, Emily leaned forward and said something about how she hoped the chefs here could make filet mignon properly this time, because last week it had been a little chewy. She laughed as though a chewy steak were a tragic inconvenience. Ethan chimed in, saying he'd heard they changed chefs but was confident this one was better. My father nodded as if he personally vetted the kitchen staff. Oh, I ordered last, as usual, not because I was asked to, but because the rhythm of this family had always put me at the end politely, unintentionally, consistently. As the conversation stretched on, I let my eyes drift toward the window. The sky outside had deepened into a dark blue wash, broken by the first handful of stars. Cars came and went in the lot, their headlights passing across the glass and over my hands like waves. The laughter at the table rose and fell behind me, light, bright, distant. I had been away long enough for it to sound foreign, like listening to people through a wall recognizable, but slightly distorted. Mom turned back toward Ethan. So, Aspen, she asked, have you two thought more about that? I heard the lodge is already getting booked up for fall weddings. Emily straightened, eyes gleaming. Yes, I was telling Ethan how perfect it would be. The mountains, the scenery, the photos. Oh my God! The photos! Everyone will be obsessed. My father nodded approvingly. Very classy choice. I reached for my water. The glass felt colder now. Part of me wished I could fold into the moment, slip into the rhythm the others moved in so easily. But another part older, steadier, knew better. I had learned long ago that fitting into a place that never saw you clearly only made the edges of you duller. Still, I stayed quiet. I always did. Quiet had become my safest space, even if it wasn't the warmest. The server returned with fresh bread. Plates clinked. Emily launched into another story about a coworker losing a shipment of decorations before an event. Ethan laughed so loudly that the couple at the next table glanced over. My parents exchanged pleased smiles like they were watching their favorite sitcom live. I watched the butter melt into the slice of bread on my plate, listened to the music humming overhead, felt the hum of the vents along the wall. It was a perfectly normal dinner, perfectly predictable, perfectly unchanged. But beneath that surface, beneath the politeness, the small talk, the glow of restaurant lights, there was something else. A shift, a faint tremor, an instinct prickling the back of my neck. Subtle but relentless. Something in the air was different. Something in me was different. And I didn't know whether to brace for it or welcome it. I only knew one thing for certain. Tonight wouldn't end the way any of us expected. The thought lingered with me as I lifted my glass again, letting the cold press against my fingers, grounding me in a moment that felt like the calm just before a landscape breaks open. The plates had barely touched the table when Ryan started talking, his voice slipping into the kind of tone people use when they're about to relive something that never really let them go. Conversation around us softened, almost as if the room sensed a shift before the rest of us did. He cut into his steak once, then set his fork down like the taste didn't matter anymore. He said it had been the longest night of his life. The way he framed it made the hairs along my arms rise, though I kept my posture steady, my hands resting gently on the napkin in my lap. I knew enough to recognize the start of a memory that carried weight. What I didn't expect was how familiar it would sound. He described a mission last winter in the mountains of Wyoming, where his rescue team had been deployed during a whiteout they never should have been flown into. Wind so violent it knocked grown men sideways, snow that swallowed visibility down to a few feet, temperatures dropping so fast their radio batteries drained within minutes. Their GPS units froze. Their markers vanished. They weren't just lost, they were trapped inside a storm that was actively shifting the ground beneath them. He paused, fingers rubbing the bridge of his nose, as if the chill from that night had crawled back into his bones. They truly believed they wouldn't make it out. He said the only reason they did was because, against all probability, A single voice managed to break through the static on their emergency channel. A voice that cut clean through the howling wind and panic. A woman's voice, low, steady, almost unnervingly calm, directing them away from a developing snowslide that would have buried them alive. The moment he described the tone of it, a calm that somehow held authority without raising its volume, my pulse stuttered. The cadence, the phrasing, the instinctive firmness laced with a strange gentleness. It was like hearing an echo strike a closed door in the back of my mind. He said the voice knew the storm's shifts before they happened, like she could see the entire mountain breathing. He said she warned them of a fissure line forming beneath the surface snow, told them the exact number of steps to shift east, then told them to stop, wait, shift again and again, guiding them along a narrow ridge, only a handful of satellite systems even captured at the time. I forced myself to breathe evenly, counting seconds in my head, but the familiarity crept up my spine like cold water. He mentioned the slope angle, the timing of the gusts, the pattern the team leader hadn't recognized, all details I remembered responding to, all commands I remembered giving. I kept my eyes on my plate, letting the steam from the steak blur my focus. He went on, explaining how the voice gave them a route that bypassed the entire unstable basin. They later learned that 30 minutes after they cleared it, the snow load collapsed and carved out a trench deep enough to swallow a 2-story building. Ethan's brows shot up. Emily gasped like she was front row at a theater performance. My parents leaned closer, captivated, drawn to the drama, the adrenaline, the heroic framing of it all. Moments like this lit them up. They loved a good survival story, the kind they could retell for years, as if they'd been part of it. It wasn't their fault. Really, they didn't know. But I did. My chest tightened when Ryan added the twist his team had believed the voice wasn't supposed to reach them at all, that dispatch had been failing for hours, that none of the protocols matched what happened. Yet somehow, the woman who guided them cut through every jammed frequency. My hands felt warm against the cloth napkin. Too warm. Then came the first shift in the air. Ryan mentioned a turn code, a specific directional marker, one that wasn't standard, one that only someone on the deep end of coordination systems would even know existed. He said it casually, like recalling the color of someone's jacket, but my breath caught, and I felt the faintest tightening in my chest. I knew that code. I'd spoken it, quietly, deliberately, into a headset. Watching a storm pattern devour half a mountain range, Ethan whistled low. Impressed, Emily leaned in, her eyes bright. He said he had never forgotten that specific code because it didn't match what he had been trained for. It came from someone who clearly saw more than the team on the ground could. I stayed perfectly still. Stillness was safer. Ethan laughed, knocking his shoulder lightly into Emily as she shook her head in disbelief. He had no idea what the code meant, and likely didn't care. But Emily leaned forward with a grin sharp enough to gleam. "That's wild," she said. "Imagine trusting some random woman over the radio in the middle of a blizzard." She must have been sitting in some cozy office far away, reading a map and pretending she knew what she was doing. My parents chuckled, nodding lightly, as if she'd said something charming instead of dismissive. They didn't see the sting underneath the joke, or how her tone carried a subtle sneer. I lowered my gaze, pressing my thumb into the folded seam of my napkin. Just a slight movement, barely noticeable, but Ryan noticed. He caught it in the half-second my hand tensed. His eyes flicked to me, lingering just a little too long. Emily kept talking, adding something about how it was hard to believe anyone, especially a woman, could stay that calm giving directions with lives on the line. She laughed again, full of confidence, unaware of the storm cloud forming behind Ryan's eyes. He wasn't laughing anymore, his head tilted a fraction, as if calibrating a thought he hadn't wanted to form, as if he were replaying the voice in his mind, comparing the tone to the quiet cadence he'd heard from me since I walked in. My stomach dipped, heavy and low. That was the first moment I felt it, the shift, the tightening in the atmosphere, the sense that the past I had worked so hard to keep sealed was beginning to bleed through the cracks. The moment Ryan Harper started to put me into a memory he thought he'd left on a mountain in Wyoming, and the moment I knew the table was about to turn in a direction none of us could undo, Ryan didn't stop talking once he started. If anything, the more attention he drew, the more the energy shifted toward him, like the entire table had begun to orbit around the story he carried. Emily leaned in with that spark she always had when the spotlight hit her proximity. She kept nudging him for extra details, bragging about how her brother had survived the kind of night most people only read about in articles written long after the danger passed. I tried to focus on the grain of the wooden table, the way the light slid along it in smooth strokes. But every sentence Ryan spoke landed with the weight of a memory I had tucked far behind me. His voice stayed steady, but mine inside my chest wavered. He said they'd been dispatched after a cluster of hikers vanished in a sudden whiteout. The storm had shifted from heavy snowfall to something more violent in less than an hour. By the time the rescue team reached the lower ridge, visibility had collapsed. Temperatures plunged. Wind pressure spiked so unpredictably that their thermal gear registered two different readings for the same patch of ground. I felt the cold settle beneath my skin as he described it. Not the kind from Colorado's early spring, but the kind that sank through layers of clothing, crawled down your spine, and rested in your bones until morning. He talked about the 6 men on his team, how 2 of them were already shaking uncontrollably by the time they reached the halfway point, how one nearly collapsed against a rock face when his muscles stopped responding, how their medic checked pulse points with fingers stiff from frost, muttering under his breath that they were minutes from severe hypothermia. I remembered those readings on my screen, the blinking numbers dropping faster than they should have. Then he mentioned the emergency beacon, how it had flickered on and off, crackling with static every time the wind shoved ice pellets against the antenna, how they had tried to recalibrate it, hitting it with the heel of a glove the way desperate people hit machines hoping they might wake up, how the only clear transmission they received was the sound of a man's voice breaking through the static, asking if anyone was out there. The voice wasn't from his team. It was the lost hiker. I held my breath. He said the man sounded terrified, slurring words, fading in and out. The rescue team tried to triangulate the location, but the signal danced around the storm, drifting like a ghost in the dark. That part I remembered. I remembered searching for the signal through layers of interference until the static burned in my ears. Ryan shifted in his seat, and the table fell quieter. Then he reached the moment that pinned me to the chair. He quoted the exact line I remembered saying. They were about to descend into a trench. A deceptive dip that looked stable, but had a load-bearing pattern on the satellite overlay that screamed danger, a pattern I'd only seen twice in my career, a pattern that meant a snowslide was moments from breaking free. Ryan said his team leader had insisted on pushing forward. The ridge ahead looked safer than the route they'd taken. Then came the voice, calm, urgent, but never panicked. The voice told them to stop immediately. When he repeated the exact instruction, the exact phrasing, I felt my spine straighten without my permission. It was unintentional, reflexive. My eyes lifted from the table to him. Sharp and direct, Ryan noticed. A flicker passed through his expression. Something like recognition, but not fully formed. He blinked slowly, as if replaying that memory in real time. He leaned back an inch, brow knitting. Hold on, that sounds familiar, before the thought could settle. Emily jumped in with a laugh so loud it startled the couple at the next table. I'm familiar with Jill. Come on, Ryan! She's never even set foot in Wyoming. The whole table chuckled light, amused, oblivious. Except Ryan and me. I didn't join their laughter. My silence wasn't loud, but it was dense like a stone sinking it beneath the surface of a lake. Ryan's gaze sharpened at that. He was watching me closely now, not with suspicion, but with a slow-growing awareness. Then Ethan chimed in, trying to be clever. Jill works in an office. She's not exactly climbing icy mountains or dodging avalanches. His tone carried the same casual dismissal I'd heard my entire adulthood. It rolled off him so easily that he didn't even realize how much space the words occupied. I didn't answer him. I turned my face toward the window, letting the chill from the glass settle against my cheek for a moment. Outside, the restaurant's patio railings held a thin crust of frost. Glowing faintly under the neon reflection, snow from the late afternoon flurry had gathered in patches, clinging to the corners like stubborn memories. I stared at it longer than necessary. Part of me needed the cold to steady the heat rising in my chest. The story Ryan told was never meant to surface at this table. It belonged to a file closed months ago, sealed under codes most people wouldn't recognize. A night that lived behind layers of protocol and confidentiality. A night where I walked the line between choosing which command might save 6 people or bury them. Yet here it was. Compliments and jokes tossed around it like it was a novelty tale. Pieces of a secret laid bare, repackaged as entertainment for a pre-wedding dinner. I tightened my grip on the napkin again, the fabric twisting faintly under my fingers. A small, almost imperceptible movement, but one that didn't escape Ryan. When I turned back toward the table, he was still looking at me, not in curiosity anymore, but with a growing certainty he didn't yet know how to voice. It wasn't accusation, it was alignment, a mental puzzle snapping into place. I could see it forming, hear it forming between the pause in his breath and the way he tilted his head, like someone listening for a sound they had heard once before in the middle of a storm. The conversation around us carried on, Emily bragging, Ethan laughing, my parents asking predictable questions that made the moment feel normal. But nothing felt normal. The past I had kept locked behind clearance levels and silence was pressing up against the edges of the present, and I could feel the first crack open. Ryan was connecting dots he wasn't supposed to see, and I no longer had the luxury of looking away. The moment Ryan finished his story, the restaurant didn't fall silent, but something inside our booth did. An invisible weight settled over the table, pressing into the space between us, stretching the air tight. Ryan planted both hands on the wood grain in front of him, leaning forward just enough that his shadow edged across his plate. He spoke like someone trying to catch a memory by its tail before it slipped away. Strange. I still remember that voice, the breathing pattern, the way she emphasized each command, almost like, before he could finish the thought, Emily shot out a laugh so sharp it sliced straight through his sentence. The kind of laugh meant to pull attention back to her, to reframe the moment before it wandered somewhere she didn't want it to go. Come on, Ryan, what are you even trying to connect here? Jillian tied to a federal rescue team. Be serious. The others took her cue like choreography they'd rehearsed for years. My parents chuckling politely. Ethan shaking his head. It was the sort of group reaction that didn't need discussion. It relied on assumption, on an old family script. And based on that script, the punchline was obvious. But Ryan didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. His eyes stayed locked on me, as if he were watching the expression I wasn't showing. His focus felt razor sharp, and my silence, usually my safest shield, suddenly felt like a narrow ledge. I didn't shift, didn't blink. Stillness was the one thing I could control. Then Ryan asked the question that split the night cleanly in half. Jill, which federal center do you work at in New Mexico? It hit the table like a dropped glass. My breath stilled. Not from fear. Fear was something I learned to mute long ago, but from calculation, because that single question had 2 trapped doors beneath it. If I answered truthfully, I'd be violating layers of clearance. If I deflected too quickly, I'd draw more suspicion. No one at that table knew I had moved to a special coordination division. No one needed to know, and especially not like this. Emily blinked rapidly, recovering faster than anyone else. What she processes paperwork. What's there to hide? Her words came with a bright, empty confidence, one that came from certainty, not knowledge. Ethan took a sip of water, shrugged, and threw in for good measure, Jill always works on those things that make no sense to anyone. Something in his voice tightened the edge of the room. There was no malice in it, just that familiar, casual dismissal I'd heard all my life. The kind of dismissal that formed dents, not cracks, small, repeated impacts that eventually reshaped the metal underneath. That was when I knew this conversation would not land softly. I met Ryan's stare and kept my tone even, smooth, measured. I'm not allowed to discuss specifics of my job. Gasps weren't loud, but they were synchronized. My parents raising eyebrows. Ethan's fork pausing midair. Emily's lips parting in a smirk that wasn't entirely friendly. To them, it sounded dramatic, pretentious, like I was spinning mystery where none existed. To me, it was the truth, frustratingly simple, terribly inconvenient. Ryan didn't lean back. He leaned in. I asked about the location, not the assignment. Why did you answer like you're guarding something classified hung in the air, like static, before a lightning strike? Emily let out a quiet scoff, the kind meant to signal everyone else to fall back into their comfort zone. Please, she's overreacting again. What? Are we supposed to believe she's part of some top-secret thing? Now? My mother and father exchanged a glance, quick, uncertain. Ethan crossed his arms with a sigh that carried both boredom and irritation. Ryan didn't look away from me, even as the others filled the space with their chatter. He spoke again, quieter this time, and something in his expression sharpened with recognition. I haven't forgotten how calm she sounded that night. The woman on the radio spoke like she was standing right next to us, even though she was miles away. His voice didn't tremble. Mine almost did. I reached for my water glass, fingers brushing the cool rim before resting lightly against it. I wasn't thirsty. I needed the anchor, the grounding, because in that moment, Ryan wasn't just remembering, he was matching, comparing what he heard in that blizzard to what was sitting across the table from him now. Someone else at the table kept talking, Emily, I think, pretending to retake the center of attention, but her words blurred around the edges, washed out by the thrum rising in my ears. The lights above us hummed faintly. A server passed with a tray held high. A chair scraped the floor 3 tables over. All background noise, all drowned out by one truth inching toward daylight. Ryan was hearing echoes, echoes no one else recognized, echoes I had hoped would never reach this room. He kept watching me. The way people watch a puzzle piece they're certain they've seen before, but never expected to find in the middle of a family dinner. And something small, tense, almost imperceptible shifted in my chest, because for the first time since he'd started talking, I realized Ryan wasn't going to let this go. And this room, this warm, noisy restaurant filled with easy laughter and familiar habits was about to become the most dangerous place I'd sat all year. The air around our table had thickened into something heavy enough to chew, the kind of tension that didn't break so much as it coiled slow, deliberate, waiting. Conversation from nearby booths drifted around us, but none of it seemed to touch our space anymore. We were sealed inside our own pressure chamber. Emily was the first to make a sound. She let out a laugh, sharp, high, and painfully forced. It bounced off the booth walls like a glass that didn't shatter only because it hadn't been dropped hard enough. So what are you implying? Ryan? That Jill is the mystery voice. That's ridiculous. Her words were bright and brittle, like something layered with glitter to disguise the crack running through the center. Dozens of eyes weren't on me, but the handful that mattered were. I could feel the weight of each one pressing into my skin. My parents waited for my reaction with wary concern. Ethan leaned back with irritation simmering under his collar. Emily watched me like she was daring me to speak, certain she'd catch something she could weaponize. Ryan, though, his stare was different. Focused. Too focused. They all waited for an admission, a denial, a slip. But silence kept me safe. Silence reminded me who I was trained to be. And today, silence was the last wall I had left. Then Ryan leaned forward, just enough that his voice reached only me, low and unsettlingly certain. You clenched your napkin exactly the way a coordinator reacts when they hear an incorrect call. That's not something an outsider does. My heartbeat stumbled, not enough to show, but enough for me to feel the tremor pulse from my ribs outward. Emily noticed the way Ryan angled toward me. She swooped in instantly, her voice pitching up. Stop it, Ryan! She likes acting mysterious, so people will pay attention to her. Don't encourage it. The comment hit with the soft cruelty only someone who thinks they're being clever can manage. Ryan turned his eyes on her, and something in his expression shifted, like he suddenly saw her clearly for the first time. Why does the idea scare you so much? Emily froze mid-breath. Just half a second, but half a second was all it took to betray her. Her smile faltered, eyes flickering with something sharp, something unsettled. She covered it quickly, but not before the crack showed, and Ryan saw it. So did I. The tension tightened another notch. Ethan pushed himself into the conversation with a voice that tried to sound composed but shook around the edges. Jill, don't make this dinner weird. This is supposed to be a family night. If there's something going on, just say it. He wasn't angry yet, just frustrated, confused, the way someone gets when the world tilts differently than they expect. But I saw the strain forming in his shoulders, the old impatience behind his eyes, the kind of impatience that had always made him assume I was being difficult simply because he couldn't understand what he wasn't meant to. I held his stare, my voice low but steady. You wouldn't understand. He slammed his palm onto the table, not hard enough to echo across the room, but hard enough to rattle the silverware between us. Why do you always have to be different? The words hit harder than the sound. He didn't realize how deep they landed, or how long they'd been traveling to reach this exact moment. Before I could respond, Ryan spoke again, slow and deliberate, like peeling back the final layer of a truth he hadn't intended to confront tonight. Jillian, were you at the Wyoming Dispatch Center that night? The table went silent, not the kind of silence filled with breath and tension, but the absolute kind that turns the world into stillness. Emily's jaw tightened. Ethan flushed crimson. My parents froze mid-motion. Every fork, every knife, every breath suspended. I stood not abruptly, but with the kind of quiet resolve that wraps itself around a final boundary. Excuse me. I need some air. I didn't wait for anyone to answer. I stepped out from the booth, feeling the heaviness cling to the back of my coat like something alive. But before I reached the edge of the dining room, Ryan's voice followed soft but unmistakable, meant for no one yet loud enough for me to catch every syllable. The odds it was her are at least 80%. That sentence uttered in the middle of a family dinner, with the calm certainty of a man stating a fact, was the first real shot fired in a battle none of us had prepared for, and once spoken, it couldn't be taken back. I left the table without a word, though my silence felt louder than any confrontation I could have started. The restaurant door shut behind me with a dull thud, and the cold outside rushed in like a slap sharp, bracing. The kind of cold that clears the fog from your thoughts, whether you want it to or not. The wind cut across the parking lot, carrying that metallic scent that only early spring nights have. Neon from the building's signage splashed pale light over the thin crust of snow, turning the ground into a patchwork of soft blue and white. I walked until my breath turned into visible clouds, then stopped beside the railing that looked out toward the distant peaks. The cold bit at my face, but it was grounding, necessary. I drew in a long breath. My hands tightened inside the pockets of my coat. I focused on the steady in and out, willing my heartbeat to slow, but I wasn't alone. Footsteps approached quickly, too determined to belong to someone who'd stepped outside casually. I didn't turn. I didn't need to. Ryan stopped a few feet behind me, the crunch of snow under his boots settling into silence. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the confusion or shock from inside, only a gravity that tugged at my spine. Jillian, don't go. The plea wasn't emotional. It was weighted with something else realization. Maybe. Or the beginning of it. I turned slightly, enough to see him from the corner of my eye. His face was tense, jaw set, eyes searching mine like he was trying to trace the truth across my expression. Then he asked the question I'd felt building since the moment he mentioned Wyoming. You were at the dispatch center that night, weren't you? I didn't respond. Couldn't. Silence wasn't just a habit, it was protocol. It was protection. It was survival. Ryan took a step closer. The cold between us tightened into something brittle, like the air might shatter. You know something, he said softly. That was the first night in my life I believed I was going to die. The wind surged harder, tugging loose strands of hair across my face. I tucked them back, shoulders stiffening, the familiar ache tightening behind my ribs. His proximity brought the warmth of his breath into the cold air, and for a moment it felt like the storm from Wyoming had followed us here. Ryan, I can't confirm or deny anything. A humorless laugh escaped him, barely audible. There it is, the exact wording they make you use. No one answers like that unless they've been trained to. The words hit harder than they should have. They weren't accusatory. They were certain. Before I could gather myself, a voice sliced through the wind. Ryan, what are you doing? She's just trying to ruin our night, Emily. Her heels clicked angrily against the pavement as she stormed toward us, fury burning in her expression. The cold didn't seem to touch her. She was fueled by something else entirely. Ryan spun toward her with a sharpness I'd never seen in him. Emily, stop! This isn't your business. The shock on her face was instant, a flash of true fear slipping through her carefully maintained bravado. It was the first honest emotion I'd seen from her all night. Then Ethan burst through the doors, rushing after her with flushed cheeks and agitation written across every line of his posture. Jill, he snapped, I don't know what you're doing, but you're embarrassing the whole family. Embarrassing? As if that were the unforgivable sin in our household. As if embarrassment hurt worse than truth. I straightened, meeting his glare with a steadiness I had earned the hard way. I'm not doing anything, I said quietly. I'm just breathing, he scoffed, folding his arms across his chest. You always have to be different. The words landed with a sting that was painfully familiar sharp, not because they were new, but because they'd been the refrain of my life. Before Ethan could say anything else, Ryan stepped between us, his shoulders taut. You know what I think, he said, turning from Ethan to Emily and then back to me. I think you two are more afraid of something about Jillian than you are of the truth. Emily paled. Afraid of her? Don't be ridiculous. Ryan's eyes narrowed, cutting straight through the lie she clung to. Then why do you interrupt every time I mention Wyoming? Why does the idea bother you so much? The wind swelled again, whipping through the space between us with a strange, charged energy. It felt like standing in the eye of something bigger than a storm. Like the next few words would alter the ground beneath our feet. I wanted to walk away. My body ached for distance, but my feet wouldn't move, not while the truth trembled so close to the surface. Ryan turned to me once more, the conflict between disbelief and gratitude flickering across his face. When he finally spoke, his voice dropped into something raw. Jillian, if it really was you, then I owe you my life. Something inside me stilled quiet, heavy, real. For the first time that night, Ryan didn't look like the man who walked into dinner with a story to tell. He looked like someone who had stumbled onto a truth that changed the shape of everything he thought he knew. About the storm, about survival, about me, and about the family standing behind us, who suddenly seemed much smaller in the shadow of that truth. The moment we stepped back into the restaurant, the warmth inside felt wrong, too soft, too bright, too normal for the storm that had already broken open between us in the cold air. No one spoke. Even the servers, moving briskly between tables, caught the tension immediately and steered clear with polite nods, pretending not to notice the way silence clung to us like frost. My parents sat stiffly, confusion carved into their expressions. They weren't angry, at least not yet. They were uneasy. The kind of unease that comes from watching a conversation you weren't part of explode just out of sight. They looked between me, Ryan, and the other two with thin, measured breaths. I slid back into my usual seat by the window, the draft brushing my arm as if to remind me nothing had changed out there. Across from me, Emily and Ethan settled into their chairs, their bodies rigid, shoulders squared like they were bracing for a hit they couldn't predict. Emily crossed her legs tightly, her jaw set. Ethan's hands balled into fists on top of the table. Though he tried to make it look casual, Ryan didn't sit. He stood beside his chair, hands gripping the back of it, posture straight and steady. His eyes moved across the table with the seriousness of someone about to deliver a verdict. It wasn't anger. It wasn't hostility. It was something heavier resolve shaped by memory. I lowered my gaze to the surface of the table, letting the coolness of it seep into my palms. I needed the contact, the grounding, something solid to tether myself to while the ground shifted beneath us. When Ryan finally spoke, every fork, every knife, every breath froze. I need to say this before we continue. The words, simple as they were, dropped into the silence with the weight of stone. My father stalled mid-motion, his spoon hovering above his bowl. My mother clasped her hands together under the table so tightly her knuckles paled. Ryan inhaled slowly, gathering himself. I've tried to keep this to myself. I really have, but I can't anymore. Ethan shot to his feet, the booth seat groaning under the sudden movement. "Ryan, this is my family's dinner. Whatever this is, it can wait. Sit down." Ryan's voice cracked through the room. Cold and unforgiving, Ethan froze. For a moment, he looked like a child again caught, chastised. Stripped of the authority he tried so hard to carry. Then, slowly, rigidly, he sat. When Ryan turned back to the rest of us, something shifted in his gaze. It softened, just barely, when it met mine, but the firmness remained. The voice that saved my life that night sounds like Jillian, terrifyingly so. The scraping sound that followed came from Emily's chair as she clutched the metal frame so tightly her nails dug into her palm. It was a sharp, metallic squeal, small, but unmistakable in the quiet. Ryan didn't pause. It wasn't just the voice. It was the breathing, the cadence, the timing of her commands, the way she controlled the panic in her tone without letting it disappear. The specific details she knew, details only someone trained in federal coordination would even recognize. Heat and cold collided inside my chest, spreading outward until my skin prickled. My stomach tightened. I stayed still, head bowed, eyes locked on the faint scratches in the tabletop. I could neither deny nor confirm, not without crossing a line I wasn't allowed to cross. My father's voice broke the silence, first unsteady. "Ruff? Jill, do you have something to say?" I parted my lips, but the answer stuck in my throat like frozen air. Clearance wasn't flexible. Secrets didn't soften. And the truth, once spoken, couldn't be taken back. I couldn't say yes. I couldn't say no. Before I could force anything out, Emily shot up like she'd been spring-loaded. "See? She has nothing to say because she's lying. She wants to ruin this dinner, and she's doing a damn good job of it. Emily, sit down." The command from Ryan reverberated through the room, louder than the previous one. Emily flinched, eyes wide, color draining from her face. She'd never been silenced like that, not by Ryan, not by anyone. She sank back into her seat, rigid and trembling. Ryan wasn't finished. He turned toward me again, and this time his voice cracked just enough to reveal something human fear wrapped in hope. "Jillian, just tell me one thing. Just one. Something that proves I'm not losing my mind. Something that proves that voice wasn't just my imagination." My fingers curled into fists against the table. I could feel every heartbeat in my palms. I was close, so close to answering, to breaking the rule I'd lived under for years, to acknowledging the night I'd tried so hard to lock away. But then my eyes drifted downward, and I saw it. A small strip of woven cord on Ryan's wrist. Worn, frayed, stained. The token, the same token survivors kept after the Wyoming avalanche incident. The same token only those who lived through it were given. My breath hitched, and in the moment my eyes touched that piece of fabric, Ryan saw the flicker in me, the recognition I'd tried to bury. He exhaled, and when he spoke again, his words were slow, deliberate, and final. "Jillian, if it wasn't you, why do I remember your voice so clearly?" The room stopped breathing. Emily's eyes darted to me, wide with real fear now, not irritation, not anger, but fear. Ethan looked at me as if the floor had disappeared beneath him. My parents stared, unmoving, their faces a mixture of disbelief, confusion, and something new, something uncomfortably close to realization. I lifted my head. Their expressions weren't curious anymore. They weren't confused. They were afraid, not of me, not exactly, but of what my silence meant. The echoes of Wyoming weren't fading. They were gathering, growing, filling every corner of the room, and like the storm Ryan had survived, this one wasn't coming from the sky. It was rising from the truth, and it was coming straight for us. I stood there, rooted to the spot, as if the floor beneath my feet had turned to glass, cold, hard, and impossibly fragile. The entire table sat suspended in silence, a silence so sharp it felt like the room itself was holding its breath along with us. Ryan's question hung in the air, trembling between accusation and desperate hope. "Osid, if it wasn't you." "Jillian, then why do I remember your voice so clearly?" Every pair of eyes fixed on me. some confused, some fearful, some bracing for whatever would come next. And in the middle of them all, I felt a pull, a moment I had spent years avoiding now drawing me in, demanding a choice I didn't want to make. I swept my gaze slowly around the table. My parents, stiff and pale. Ethan, still flushed with anger, he didn't yet know where to aim. Emily, trembling with fury and fear. And Ryan standing, not because he sought attention, but because truth had shaken the ground under him and left him no space to sit. It was no longer about protocol, or secrecy, or the lines I had been trained never to cross. It was about a man haunted by a voice in a storm, a voice that had stayed with him because it pulled him back from the edge of death. And it was about the fact that I couldn't keep running from what he already knew. I drew in a deep breath. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds hold, 2 seconds out. The rhythm drilled into me through years of training, a rhythm that steadied the mind when chaos tried to swallow it whole. Then I lifted my head. What came out of my mouth was not the voice I used every day, not the voice my family brushed aside whenever I spoke, not the voice they associated with the oldest daughter who blended into the background. It was that voice, controlled, measured, calm in a way that only comes from giving orders when lives depend on them. Dispatch to Rescue Team Alpha. Hold position. Do not descend the ice trench. Repeat, do not descend. Follow ridgeline 7 degrees east. Stay with me. The words rolled out with a precision that cut through the restaurant's low chatter, slicing straight through the air between us. The cadence echoed the same pattern I'd used that night, the night the storm nearly swallowed 6 men whole. Somewhere behind us, a glass dropped and shattered a burst of sound that startled a neighboring table. But at ours, nothing. Not a breath, not a whisper, not a twitch of movement. We were a frozen tableau, trapped inside a moment none of us could undo. Ryan moved first. He shot to his feet, but it wasn't shock that drove him upright. It was recognition pure, unmistakable recognition. His hand rose to his face, fingers trembling as he tried to steady himself against a truth that had slammed into him like a blast of mountain wind. My God. He staggered 1 step back, eyes glistening, breath shallow. It's you. It's really you. Emily made a sound somewhere between denial and panic. Her voice cracked, rising too high, too sharp. No, no, she's faking it. She's... Ryan didn't let her finish. Enough! Emily! His tone was steel cold, absolute, and harder than I'd ever heard from him. Emily snapped her mouth shut, face blanching, as if she'd been slapped by the very idea that someone might shut her down in front of witnesses. Ethan's face drained of color, his shoulders slouched, all bluster collapsing in on itself. His hands, once balled into fists, now trembled faintly beside his plate. My parents, they stared at me like they were seeing a stranger wearing my features. Confusion, disbelief, and the first glimmer of guilt flickered in their eyes, emotions they'd never intended to confront tonight, but now had no choice but to sit with. I didn't revel in their shock. I didn't need vindication. I didn't crave applause or validation or some sudden shift in how they saw me. I just wanted the truth acknowledged. Cleanly, quietly. So I said, in the calmest voice I had, I did what I had to do. That's all. But the simplicity of it only made Emily explode. You just couldn't take it. Could you? She shouted, tears streaking down her cheeks. You had to hijack the moment. You had to make everything about you on my weekend. At my dinner. Before my wedding. I didn't flinch. I didn't even look at her. I didn't need to defend myself. Ryan did that for me. Do you not hear yourself, he said, his voice low enough to be dangerous. You mocked her. You mocked the person who saved my life, saved my team. You owe her far more than you'll ever understand. He reached for his wrist and unfastened the small braided cord he had worn all night, the Wyoming token weathered, frayed, and heavy with the weight of near death. He stepped around the table. Every eye followed him, and then he placed the cord gently into my open hand. His fingers shook, not from cold, but from emotion he no longer tried to hide. I kept this to remind myself I needed to find the person who saved us. He said softly, I always imagined him as some older guy with decades of field experience, someone commanding, someone legendary. He held my gaze. Turns out, she was sitting right in front of me the whole time. Emily's sobs overtook her. Ethan bowed his head, unable to look at me. My parents sat frozen silent, speechless, undone. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. Because in that moment, the truth didn't just settle into the space between us. It reshaped everything. There are moments that strip a family down to its bones. Moments that peel away politeness, old habits, and all the comfortable illusions people build around themselves. What was left at our table wasn't warmth or unity or familiarity. It was the raw truth of who we were when the masks cracked. My father broke the silence first. His voice, usually anchored with certainty, trembled across the space between us. "Jill, why didn't you ever tell us?" He looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time, not as the daughter who blended into the background, not as the steady presence he could overlook without consequence, but as someone with contours he'd never bothered to examine. A stranger wearing my face. I met his eyes, letting him feel every inch of the distance that had grown between us over the years. "I did tell you. Many times. You just heard what you wanted to hear. The truth wasn't bitter. It was simply honest, clean, sharp, and impossible to ignore." His shoulders sagged slightly, as if the weight of that realization pressed down on him all at once. My mother placed a hand over her chest, fingers trembling against her blouse. We thought you preferred stability, a normal job, something predictable, paperwork and routine." I almost laughed, but the sound never reached my throat. "That's what you assumed," I said softly. "Not what I said." She lowered her hand, her gaze dropping to the table as if the polished wood might offer her a better version of events. But it didn't. It only reflected the moment exactly as it was, cold, stark, and unfiltered. Then came a small, sharp voice. "So, are you happy now? Did you get what you wanted?" Emily's mascara had smudged down her cheeks in dark streaks, her foundation cracking around the edges as the heat of the night clashed with the cold fury in her expression. She looked at me like I had personally struck her, as if the truth that had unraveled wasn't about her behavior, but about how she'd been exposed by it. "You wanted to destroy my life, didn't you? You knew this would ruin everything." Before I could respond, Ryan spoke. Not with anger, not even with impatience, but with a kind of clarity that was sharper than any accusation. "Emily, Jillian didn't destroy anything. The truth did, and you were terrified of it long before it showed up." His words hit her harder than any raised voice could have. She blinked, stunned, as if she had been slapped by honesty itself. Ethan, who had been sitting stiff and silent, finally spoke. His voice was softer, thinner, the bravado drained from it. "Jill, you didn't mean for all of this to get so out of hand, right? You didn't want our family to be like this." He looked at me with something like pleading a hope that I would undo the tension, smooth things over the way I always had, clean up the mess, make it easier for everyone else. But I was done being the quiet one who absorbed the fallout. I held his gaze, letting him see the truth he'd refused for years. "I don't want anyone to be embarrassed. Ethan, I never did. I just don't want to be invisible anymore." The silence that followed was thick and heavy, dropping over the table like a lead blanket. My father closed his eyes, pained. My mother swallowed hard. Ethan looked away. And Ryan exhaled a long, weary breath that sounded like a decision finally solidifying in his chest. "Jillian, I owe you the lives of everyone on that mountain. I can't stand beside someone who treats you like garbage." Emily stiffened, something panicked flashing across her face. "Well, what are you saying?" Ryan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His clarity was louder than volume. "You mock people to feel taller. Emily, you belittle the woman who saved me because her existence threatens your image. I won't marry someone who carries jealousy like oxygen." His fingers moved to his ring. The engagement ring he'd worn for months. The one they'd taken pictures of, posted about, boasted over. He slid it off with calm finality. When the metal hit the table, the sound echoed through our booth like a gavel calling judgment. Emily let out a strangled cry, half rage, half heartbreak. Ethan scrambled to stand, reaching for Ryan's shoulder. Desperate to stop what was unraveling, Ryan stepped out of reach. "I'm done," he said quietly. "I won't tie my life to someone who disrespects the person who kept me alive." My parents sat frozen, unable to look at him, at Emily, or at me. Ethan stared helplessly between all of us, his world folding in on itself. Emily was sobbing now, loud, messy, and raw. Pain radiated from her in waves, but beneath it, something else pulsed: humiliation, the kind she'd always been terrified of. And I felt nothing I expected to feel. Not triumph, not vindication, not satisfaction, just a quiet, weary ache. I reached for my coat, sliding it over my shoulders with a calmness that felt foreign even to me. The scene in front of me was breaking apart in real time, but I had already stepped outside of it emotionally, mentally, long before I stood up. "I'm going home," I said, the words steady, measured. Not because I pitied Emily, not because I wanted to avoid the aftermath, but because the truth had already done its work. It had cut and exposed and reshaped everything it needed to, and I didn't need to watch the pieces fall. Snow drifted in slow, wandering spirals as I stepped out of the restaurant and into the night. The cold caught my face immediately, sharp enough to clear out the last remnants of the chaos behind me. The door shut with a muted thud, sealing off the voices, the shock, the tears, the ring hitting the table like a verdict. Out here, everything was quieter, cleaner, honest. The parking lot was nearly empty, blanketed in a thin layer of fresh snow that glowed faintly under the street lamps. I walked through it, my boots crunching softly, my breath forming pale clouds that dissolved before I could finish exhaling. The wind carried a faint scent of pine, winter, and something that felt a little like possibility. When I reached my car, I paused with my hand on the door handle. For a second, I just stood there, letting the cold seep into my bones until the tension inside me loosened. Then I opened the door and sat inside, pulling the door shut behind me. The interior was icy, but it was my space, quiet, unjudging, free of the tight stares and strained voices I'd left behind. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the Wyoming survivor token Ryan had given me. A small braided cord, frayed from being worn every day for a year. Something carried not for show but for memory, for respect. I turned it over between my fingers, such a small thing to hold so much weight. Then I placed it in the compartment beside the steering wheel, not as a trophy, not as a burden, just as something true, something no one could twist or diminish. Almost immediately, my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I pulled it out, the cold air making the screen flicker briefly before the notification sharpened. Federal Ops. New mission briefing, 0700 hours, Las Cruces, NM. A new assignment, another operation, another moment where my voice would matter. I let out a long breath, not of exhaustion but of relief. A sense of clarity settled into me, quiet but absolute, the kind that arrives only after truth has torn something open. I looked through the windshield at the restaurant behind me. Its warm light spilled into the night, turning the snow gold. From the outside, the place looked inviting, like the kind of space families filled with laughter and holiday photos. But tonight's glow felt hollow, like a mask that didn't fit anymore. Maybe it never had. I started the engine. The heater coughed awake, blowing cold air that slowly warmed. I kept my hands on the wheel, but didn't shift into drive yet. Not until I finished looking at the place where the version of my family I'd tried to belong to had finally cracked open. Inside that glow, Ethan was probably pacing, confused and angry. My mother was likely whispering apologies shaped by habit. Not understanding, my father would be rubbing his temple, trying to turn the night into something more rational, easier to digest. Emily would be breaking apart, loud and explosive. Ryan. Silent, steady, resolute, and I didn't feel victory or smugness or righteous satisfaction. I felt empty, but in a freeing way, as if a weight I'd carried so long had become mistaken for a part of me, and now it was gone. I shifted the car into reverse, backed out of the parking space, and turned toward the exit. Snowflakes streaked across the headlights as the tires rolled over the icy pavement. At the edge of the lot, I checked my mirror. No one had followed. No one stepped into the cold to call after me. No one reached for me. The space behind me remained still and silent. For the first time in my life, that didn't sting. It felt like confirmation. I merged onto the main road heading south. The streetlights thinned quickly, giving way to long stretches of dark highway and the distant outline of mountains. The storm clouds overhead shifted slowly, revealing slivers of sky dotted with faint stars. I cracked the window open, letting in a blast of cold air. It rushed through the car, whipping my hair and cooling the last of the heat in my cheeks. But it wasn't harsh. It felt invigorating, like the first honest breath after years of shallow ones. Miles slid beneath the tires. The town faded behind me. My shoulders eased. I thought about Ethan, his frustration, his confusion. Part of me hoped he'd grow from this, learn to question the roles he'd inherited. Another part of me knew he might cling to the narrative that made him feel safe. Time would tell. My parents. Maybe this would make them look at me without the blurred lens of expectations. Maybe they'd ask real questions someday. Maybe they wouldn't. I wasn't waiting anymore. And Emily, well, some storms don't simply reveal people. They remove them. Then there was Ryan. His expression when he realized the truth, part shock, part gratitude, part something weightier lingered in my thoughts. Not because he owed me his life. I hadn't guided that team to earn his admiration. His gratitude mattered because it was anchored in reality, in clarity, in seeing me without distortion. Few people ever had. The snow began to thin the farther south I drove, turning into a fine mist that the wind swept across the road. The sky widened, growing darker, deeper, an expanse of space that felt welcoming rather than isolating. The heater warmed the car, and I rolled the window up halfway. The token beside the wheel shifted with the motion, a faint sound that matched the rhythm of the tires on the pavement. Around me, the world grew quieter still. The kinds of quiet you couldn't hear inside a house full of expectations, the kind you could only find in motion, on an empty highway, heading toward a place where you were needed, not tolerated. New Mexico's border sign appeared in the distance, faintly illuminated by the headlights, a small, simple marker that symbolized something huge: home. Not because it held my family, but because it held my purpose. I tightened my grip on the wheel steady, certain the life waiting for me wasn't perfect. It wasn't glamorous or simple or free of risk, but it was mine. Built by choices no one else understood, shaped by work no one else saw, defined by strength no one else acknowledged until tonight forced them to. I wasn't leaving anything behind. I was returning to myself. The road opened wide ahead, dark, familiar, endless, and as I drove into it, the snow finally stopped. Only the wind remained, sweeping across the plains, clearing a path before me. For the first time in 38 years, I felt entirely, unmistakably free.